Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Reclaiming the Legacies of the Civil Rights Movement to celebrate Professor Hajar Yazdiha's groundbreaking new book. I'm Jody. I know, we're so excited and happy for you, Haj. I'm Jody Aegis Vallejo. I'm a professor of sociology and American studies and also the associate director of the USC Equity Research Institute, where we produce data-driven analysis and rigorous research for social change. Before we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that USC is located on Tongva land. And one of the things that we want to do is challenge the inaccurate narrative that the state of California was built by immigrants. We want to acknowledge that the land we reside on was taken by a settler colonial society that exploited immigrant, native, and enslaved people. And as we recognize this history, we have to also grapple with what it means to live on stolen land, understand our role and responsibilities as guests on Native American homelands, and be committed to supporting the struggle for Native nations' sovereignty and self-determination. So hey Daisy. Thanks for joining us tonight. Our conversation this evening is a collaborative effort with USC Equity Research Institute, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, the Department of Sociology, and the Levin Institute for the Humanities. And I'd like to especially thank our staff at ERI. Where's our staff? Raise your hands, everybody who's over here helping us out tonight. Especially our amazing ERI events team, including Rhonda Ortiz, Kim Tabari, Eunice Velarde, Gladys Malabiran, and especially Paris Valoria and Deborah Gata. Thank you so much for all your work. So I'm going to introduce our amazing panel, and then I'll turn it over to our moderator. And of course, it's just my extreme pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Professor Hajar Yazdiha. Professor Yazdiha is an assistant professor of sociology. She's a faculty affiliate at ERI, and she was also at ERI our inaugural postdoctoral fellow in civil society and social change. She's also a Ford Fellow, an Israeli Global Scholar, a public sociologist with op-eds appearing in outlets like the LA Times and The Hill. And her award-winning research on race, immigration, and social movements has been published in top journals. And of course, she's the author of The Struggle for the People's King, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement. Published by Princeton University Press, and you can buy this book later on tonight where Haj will sign books. We have right here from our bookstore, and don't forget to take a picture with this amazing book cake that we have. And I'm really also especially honored to introduce our esteemed scholars here tonight. First, I'm going to introduce Walter Julio Nicholls. He's a professor of urban planning and public policy at the University of California, Irvine. He's a prolific scholar of social movements, immigration, and cities, and the author of The Immigrant Rights Movement, The Battle Over National Citizenship, as well as several other books. And Marcus Anthony Hunter is professor of African American Studies and Sociology and also the Scott Waugh Endowed Chair at UCLA. He's an expert in race, cities, politics, and comparative historical sociology, and he's authored 3 award-winning books, including Chocolate Cities, The Black Map of American Life. And last but not least, it is my sincere honor to introduce my friend and our moderator tonight, Dr. Varun Soni. Dean Soni is the head of religious life at the University of Southern California, where he brings together the spiritual and scholarly resources of the university. Some of you might not know that Dean Soni is also a lawyer. He's a radio host, so we're expecting big things of you tonight, Dean Soni, and a scholar who studies religion and popular culture. And I really cannot think of a better person to be our guide this evening. Thank you so much. Let's give it up for our panel.
I have 12 physicians in my family, so I needed every degree. My PhD means nothing to any of them. And my wife tells me I have a face for radio. So it sounds cool, but the reality isn't as cool. My name is Varun Soni. I'm the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life here at USC. You can see how much I've aged over the last 15 years since I've been here. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the release of an extraordinary new book by our beloved colleague. The book is The Struggle for the People's King, and the author, of course, is Dr. Hajar Yazdiha. In the post-civil rights era, wide-ranging groups have made civil rights claims that echo those made by Black civil rights activists of the 1960s, from people with disabilities to women's rights activists and LGBTQ coalitions. Increasingly, since the 1980s, white right-wing social movements, from family values coalitions to the alt-right, now claim the collective memory of civil rights to portray themselves as newly oppressed minorities. In the struggle for the people's king, Dr. Hajar Yazdiha reveals how these powerful groups remake collective memory toward competing political ends. They generate offshoots of remembrance that distort history and threaten the very foundations of multicultural democracy. Powerful and persuasive, the struggle for the people's king demonstrates that these oppositional uses of memory fracture our collective understanding of who we are, how we got here, and where we go next. I am super, super grateful to Dr. Hajar Yazdiha for her boldness and brilliance in writing this book. It's really a gift for all of us at the right time. I'm especially appreciative of the presence of our illustrious and highly accomplished conversation partners this evening, Dr. Walter Nicholls from UCI and Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter from UCLA. As someone who does interfaith work for a living, I have to say that bringing together Trojans, Bruins, and Anteaters is the real interfaith work in the City of Angels, so we're off to a really good start here. Most of all this evening, I'm so thankful to all of you for being here at this event today. As I get older, I realize that the most important currency in life is not money, but time. We can always make more money, but we can never make more time. One of the most important questions we ask ourselves as human beings is, how do I want to spend my time? And so on behalf of today's sponsors and organizers, I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. This is a great turnout for a great event. Thank you. This evening's event will unfold in the following manner. First, we'll have a conversation about the book's themes as a panel. Then we'll open it up to Q&A with everyone here today. And then we're going to throw it down and have a big party in this room. I've been hearing about book cake. I'm like, what's book cake? And then I saw it. I'm like, oh, that's obviously a book cake. It is pretty incredible. Rivals Indian wedding cakes. And then we're also going to have the opportunity to purchase this extraordinary book. Hudge has generously agreed to autograph it, memorialize it, personalize it. So make sure afterwards you buy a copy for yourself and your 12 best friends. Let's get into it. I'm going to join you here. Hey, Mike. So I'm going to start with you. Congratulations. This is a big day, and it's wonderful to celebrate in front of so many friends and colleagues. I guess I'll just ask you a simple question to start off, which is, why did you write this book, and what did you learn?
Wow. First of all, my heart is so full. So thank you all for being here. Just the team that put this together, so immense. And Jody, thank you for spearheading. But ERI, truly, I know you were at the helm, and I'm so grateful. This is a book that really came out of sitting in graduate school, looking at the landscape as it was changing in the post-Obama years, and thinking about this question of why it is that there was this rise of a kind of reactionary right-wing politics, and specifically one that was invoking Dr. King's words to justify rolling back, for example, voting rights, making claims to affirmative action as a form of reverse racism, and just this overarching question of how is it that something that is so egregious and misusing and distorting the past, how is it that it makes its way into kind of mainstream life? How is it that it can make its way to the highest court in the land? So that was really the animating question. And what ended up happening is 6 years of research. So I basically pieced together and puzzled through 40 years of data from 1980 to 2020. And this is like thousands and thousands of newspaper articles, organizational documents, press releases, transcripts, just everything I could get my hands on to trace what's actually happening where we get to this moment where we're looking around and seeing Dr. King's words used to roll back the very things that he fought for. So that was really the origin story of the book. And I think for me, there are really three major takeaways that hopefully we can build on in our conversation today. I think the first one is really what I was surprised by is just how intentional a strategy it is. Because I think initially I was looking at these misuses of the past and thought, oh, these are just rhetorical moves. I think at times there's sort of ignorance at play. It's kind of convenient political posturing. We see it all the time. But no, there's actually a lot of behind the scenes paperwork where you see it documented very explicitly that there are political strategists who understand that Dr. King's memory is a really powerful symbol in American culture. It really does a good job of representing the racial past. And so the way that we remember the racial past has really high stakes for what we do about it in the present. And so if you distort it, if you sanitize it, if you wash it all away and make it seem like racism ended with Dr. King, then you don't have to deal with racial inequality today. So that was one of the big findings for me, was like, oh, this is actually super intentional. It's not just sort of, misguided. I think the second big takeaway, the one that for me really rings the alarm, is that it's had severe consequences for multicultural democracy. So it's not just that we see it used in the service of rolling back, for example, affirmative action, used in the service of claiming that voting rights should be the state's domain, so we don't have to actually have federal oversight. It's the idea that there is a fundamental question at the heart of the misuses of memory about who counts as a true American. And I think those are the ones that we've seen come to such violent ends in January 6th, for example, in a lot of the manifestos that are left behind after these mass shootings. But I also hope that we can think a little bit about some of the more hopeful takeaways. And I think that's the big third one, the one that usually we end with, but that I want to just sort of drop in right now because already the book sounds so bleak, right? Which is that there is so much to be learned from the legacies of the civil rights movement. There's so much we don't learn in our textbooks and our kind of common conceptions of what happened and why it happened. There's so many helpful nuggets there in the legacies of the Black freedom struggle that really do light the way for us moving forward. And so I think of the book as a kind of choose your own adventure in the sense that I did study all sorts of different movements over these 40 years. And so for any sort of personal kind of question or social interest that you may have, I think there's something in the book for you. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to the two of you. And, with Varun moderating, it's just 3 different sort of perspectives coming to the table. And so I'm going to throw it back to you because I'm like, let's hear from them.
Thank you. One of the things I really love about this book is that it's a work of history, but it really is speaking to the present moment. Everything that you're talking about in the book is playing out in the zeitgeist through the culture wars, through immigration debates, through the banning of CRT, and et cetera. So, Marcus, you recently, earlier this year, wrote an LA Times op-ed about what's happening in Florida around curricular revision / omission, what that means for Black studies, sort of the weaponization against critical race theory. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the country in terms of book bannings, curricular revisions, and how that might tie into some of the themes that Haj talks about in her book?
Yeah, thank you so much. Congratulations. Shout out to Jody for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, especially because I just live up the street. So this was like easy, great for me. To the question, I think the aspect of the book I enjoy the most is really thinking about how, and Varun, you mentioned this earlier, like time as currency, but also memory as currency. Especially when we think about, I've been in the reparations space for a while now, and one of the first things that comes up all the time is like, paying people cash money, which is a form, but people don't take a lot of stock in other forms that don't cost actual money, but actually are money. And so memory is one of them. And what I enjoy a lot about the book is that it's explicitly and implicitly demonstrating that Black memory is super powerful. So powerful, people are using it all the time, even as they tell us not to teach it, not to learn it, not to use it, but it's like apparently making things happen in a very lazy, incompetent government. So you can use something that we're told has no value. By we, I mean we as Black people are constantly told through a steady diet of information and misinformation that our history is vacant. It doesn't matter. It doesn't move the needle. All it does is take us back to a dreary place where everybody walks away either a victim or a culprit, and nobody gets anything, except, as you masterfully show, people are using it to, keep guns in schools. People are using it to create equal marriage. People are using it to try to create some kind of standing for people who are undocumented. So you see it playing out. But I think underneath all of it is people understanding at some point. So we see this very intentionally with the Muslim experience, where you're finding out that you're politically black. And I think for me, one of the big take homes from the book for me is political blackness. That what happens is people really do, in the words of Chuck D, believe the hype. Oh, you come to America, as long as you're not black, you're good. We have a spot for you and all of that kind of stuff. Only except they discover if you Muslim, you black. And you keep trying to find ways to not be black in that and be like, actually, 32% of us are white, which I thought was really deep, that people who are Arab are calling themselves white in the census. Because basically, the proxy for Muslim as an American thing is from black Muslims. So it's really interesting to see people borrow and be in the identity that Malcolm X helped create and make real as an American, but also be like, we're not the black people though. Don't consider us that. And then they try that and then they go, adjacent black. What if we just say, we understand the struggle? It's hard out here if you have something that's not normative. If you're not Christian, it's almost like being black, but not black. Don't confuse us. I like my credit score, I like getting loans, I like credit cards, I like not being followed, like all of the benefits of not being black. I love those. But then that doesn't work. And then it becomes, once upon a time not long ago, Dr. Martin Luther King said, black, 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 more black, black on black. So when you see it, I think what really demonstrates, I hope, one of the take-home messages for people who are black is to see that our history, the memory of our history, actually still has the ability to move the needle of America, whether it be all the way left, all the way right, but there's a lot of power in it. And I hope that the book helps to encourage people to reclaim that power and to really think about how we can use it for the issues that we protest and we're still not seeing any movement on.
Thank you. Walter, some of the themes of Hodge's book really intersect with your work, particularly in the immigration space. And I'm curious how you think about stigmatized groups like undocumented immigrants, constructing, legitimizing representation. What are the risks of that kind of process too? And how might that highlight some of the themes that Hodge highlights in her book around historical memory, revision, storytelling?
Oops, sorry, I barely use these things. So thank you again for everybody who organized this. It's really, when I was reading this book, and I sent Haj an email saying, wow, it's very rare that I read a book and get really excited and start taking down notes and I'm like engaging in it fully. So it's a really beautiful book, well written, well researched, and really well theorized. So it's a really brilliant book. So I recommend everybody buy it. It's right there. So the reason why I liked it if I had nothing to do with this area, but I do. I study immigration and I study undocumented immigration and how political representations are constructed. And so in this space, in the immigration space, there's what I've seen in my work on immigration was a process of constructing representations of this group that has been highly stigmatized, and the process of constructing a political representation was very important because of the fact that this group wasn't necessarily recognized. Undocumented immigrants were recognized as rights-deserving human beings. They didn't have the right to have rights. So the process of constructing political representations was a necessary condition for achieving voice in the political sphere. And we see this through the process of constructing collective memory. It's a constant process of groups speaking to the public, trying to get legitimacy by employing language, images, representations, performances that resonate with dominant cultural norms. So in this case, sort of idea of assimilationism, which was sort of central to King's message as well. The American dream. So in the undocumented immigrant youth movement, it was the dreamers. So constantly reconstructing this idea of the stigmatized group in order to generate legitimacy for that group. Now, it's both necessary and effective. If you don't do that, then you'll become the other. You'll become the stigmatized. You'll become noise rather than voice. And that's a very serious difficulty in politics. There's no path to inclusion without employing this type of language, which is sort of the paradox. But it's also effective. No, it's also effective. This type of language, for example, again, the Dreamers, did construct a very sort of resonant image to call themselves, dreamers, carrying the flag, saying we're dreamers and not criminals, and this allowed them to elevate their voice. And it created an opening within the political sphere for themselves. So it was important, it was necessary, but it's also sort of seriously problematic, because of the fact that oftentimes you're constructing this language by reinforcing dominant national norms of citizenship that are exclusionary. And that could also be employed and redeployed by your political enemies. So on the one hand, it's necessary, but on the other hand, it's contradictory because you're employing language. You're deploying norms of citizenship that are by themselves very exclusionary. You're just sort of changing the boundaries of citizenship, but not really transforming them. And that becomes a problem. And it's a paradox of politics. But what's also interesting, and another part I liked about your book, is that folks, when they're constructing political representations, it's oftentimes they're not only speaking to the public, but they're also speaking to constituents, to other activists, to themselves. And they're in the process of constructing a new identity for a particular group. And there are leaders. So Hajar's book talks about gatekeepers and kingmakers. There's a hierarchy in the representational process of producing voice, of producing representation, producing identity. And that's important because then the question that you touched on a bit in your book, but the question that I'm always interested in is who's constructing those representations within these social movements? Who controls the means of representations, of political voice? And oftentimes within social movements, those are the people with cultural resources, financial resources, and political resources. And these folks oftentimes, especially in movements of the most marginalized people. And this becomes sort of an interesting process. So you need to construct representations. These representations and memories need to resonate with dominant norms, but this results in reproducing these types of norms of exclusion, even though you're trying to create inclusion. And it also results in sort of political hierarchies within movements of those who speak and those who are spoken for. And that's another paradox, because in order to achieve political empowerment, you have to alienate yourself from the means of representation. And that's a very weird paradox, I think. So it's an interesting, fascinating book.
My family came over after the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act from India. And in order to immigrate from India, there's 40 years of Asiatic exclusion for purposes of naturalization. Before that, you basically had to be a physician or engineer. And so my family, that's why I have a lot of physicians in my family came over to really, nice jobs. We had sort of educational privilege. And in so many ways, my family, Indian Americans, I would argue Asian Americans, really benefited from the work of the civil rights pioneers and the civil rights movement. And yet when we got here, we were told that we were the model minority. There was a very different narrative that I was raised with that I now see as a weaponization in some ways against Black and Latinx communities. And so for my community, I felt like we really benefited from the civil rights movement, and yet we also in some ways participated in a historical retelling of what that meant for us. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of tension between being the beneficiaries of something and also, in some ways, exploiting it, perhaps unintentionally? When I was raised, we were raised with that as a point of pride. It wasn't until I looked back upon it where I really began to unpack it.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. It's the one that I wrote the op-ed about in the LA Times, which you helped with, so thank you for that. I think what's hard about it is, so I've been getting a lot of interviewer questions from journalists about Vivek Ramaswamy and to Nikki Haley, and they're definitely representations of exactly what you're talking about, which is using the model minority trope to say something about how they are a success story, they are evidence of the American dream, they're evidence of meritocracy being very real in the United States, that if you just work hard enough, if you have good family values, you can rise up in the ranks. And you see it, to really bitter ends, especially with Vivek, who has gone so far as to say that, if elected, he would pull back birthright citizenship. I think what's really difficult is that, I say this a lot, but the history of immigration in the United States is a history of making yourself as proximate as you can to whiteness. And that's not because white is the ideal, it's because white equals humanity in the United States. That is when you get to be fully human. And so to make yourself as analogous to whiteness, if you look back at all of the sort of legal claims that are sort of the foundation of immigration history, it's always about making a claim that we are white. And so when you think about even just well-intentioned families that are coming over and working really hard, right? I think it's difficult to shift the narrative to think about that as an anti-Black story because there's no evil intent, right? There's no sort of hate in the heart. And so I think that's been one of the struggles, especially in trying to communicate the way that anti-Blackness is so deeply embedded in society, such that immigrants, especially non-white immigrants, who are trying to make their way, often do reproduce and recreate the anti-Blackness. I will say, I just recently went back to that LA Times piece and I made the mistake of reading the comments section, which is like always a mistake. Everyone's like, why did you do that? Yeah, no, it's a mistake. But I think it's like, I think it's a helpful window, though, into the way a lot of folks think about it, which is that we did work hard. And if you are claiming that our community is anti-Black simply because we tried to live in the best communities for our children, send them to the best schools, I think there's a resistance to trying to understand how that is part of the system that pits racialized minorities against one another, because folks know if we come together, we're unstoppable, right? So you make sure that we're pitted against one another. We're always sort of playing the game where we're trying to get the one leg up. Our community sort of did this better than others. This is something I show in the Muslim chapter that you described. And I think what's also hard, which Marcus talked about, is that even when you get to the point of kind of an awakening, where you realize that you're not separate from the system of anti-Blackness, you're in fact very much shaped by it, even those strategies to develop kind of an analogous identity, make a claim that like, oh, we're racialized like Black, so often exclude Black Americans. And I think that's like the real struggle as I see it, is first of all, making the leap to understand a history that does not allow you to be separate from white supremacy. Like it is the air we breathe, right? I think the second leap, though, is then understanding that solidarity politics goes so much deeper than kind of a performance of kumbaya and colorblindness and holding hands. There has to be a true commitment to seeing one another's humanity. So it's like a two-step process that's like maybe not going to happen in our lifetime, but I do think even just talking about it and recognizing it within our own communities, for me, for example, in the Iranian American community, is really essential.
Marcus, you coined the term Black Lives Matter.
I did.
And so you've really been not just, a scholar writing about issues, but you've been really on the forefront of what is the largest social protest movement of my lifetime. How did you think about that in terms of the connection with the civil rights movement and you talked about memory and storytelling and maybe even mythology in terms of coming to Black Lives Matter from that historical sort of context?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The first thing I will say is where we heard the term like racial reckoning, right? And there's a lot to be said about that. And the book does a great job of talking about that. And I often, and I'm like an optimist, I listen to the song Optimistic by Sounds of Blackness every day. So if you live with me, you're like sick of it. But it's because it's sort of what Haj just said, like even by talking about it, especially something that was previously politically taboo or not to be discussed, that is some form of progress. Like it isn't the legislation yet, it isn't the policy, it isn't, all of the things, but it is something. And so I say that to say, for my part, I've really been looking at the civil rights period as a kind of marker for some of what we've seen, meaning that is often lauded as like this big moment in American history, one that you can almost reach out and touch because many of the people are still alive, where that is real. Like you don't feel like it's like, a fake YouTube stunt, like that's real. That there really was a march. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is a real person. We know that to be true, and we are not that far removed from it. And so it becomes a really important launching pad. But I think there are certain things that are different that we don't really take a lot of account for. For example, the civil rights movement was really about creating an organized mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. to create the progressive legislation that it wanted. You demonstrate the public will, and then you get the legislation. In our case, there's a ton of progressive legislation. You can go find it on congress.gov. But there's been no mass demonstration around that. So we're actually in this weird vacuum where we have not yet had mass demonstration aligned with progressive legislation at all. Now, people think they've done it. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Like, people did that. That was amazing, especially because it was mostly not black people doing it at a time where black people were disproportionately dying of COVID and all of the stuff that people were saying Black Lives Matter for. So seeing that was important, but people don't necessarily understand that that has to also be demonstrated at the president's doorsteps. Like, if you really want them to understand it to be true, there's a reason why Washington, D.C. was created out of nowhere. Because you have to demonstrate it at the steps of the Capitol. You have to demonstrate it at the steps of the White House. And we haven't yet done that. But what's happened, though, is there are all of these public entities that have risen up as like public intellectuals or, activists that people, everyday people sort of think, I did my Black Lives Matter protest, I voted like I was supposed to, and now I'm looking for fill-in-the-blank person to be doing that work. It is sad for me to report being in a million Zooms, okay, a million work groups, a million conversations. Most all of those people, if not all of them, are not present. So that means that we are not connected the way we think we are. The people who you hear about, they're doing great work. I'm not trying to knock anybody, but they are not in these meetings. They are not advocating for this legislation. Many of them are not even aware there is legislation, even as they're talking about things that sound like they would be. So one of the tensions, I think, is really around us having a public demonstration of the will we have, and also to move away from, and this is, I've been organizing an equity march June 15th next year, and I went out to the March on Washington's 60th anniversary to do a dry run and get a sense of where things go. And it was great. I'm not gonna say anything negative about it, but what I did realize is I understand why everyone uses the National Mall and the Lincoln Memorial, but I'm tired of this reflecting pool. We've been reflecting for 60 plus years. Let's march our asses out of this space and closer to the White House. That's what I'm on. It's literally called the reflecting pool. What does it mean for us to 60 years keep going back to a reflecting pool when we've reflected? We know that there's systemic inequity everywhere. I don't need more reflection questions. I need action. So it's really about us understanding that they chose that location because of their place in time. And 2025 will be 160 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. What are we doing to demonstrate the public will in that area of the world so we can say that we are holding you accountable for voting you in on equity promises and not having it now?
Walter, one of the things that Haj sort of suggests in her book is that storytelling or historical reimagination can be an incubator for activism on any side. And a lot of your research also focuses on how cities themselves as lived environments can also be an incubator for the activism. Is there an intersection between cities and storytelling that can incubate activism in particular ways with particular kinds of DNAs for particular with particular points of view?
Yes.
And anyway, you can elaborate?
Yes. So a lot of my work looks at so a lot of my studies, I look at sort of representations, but also how activism emerges from sort of concrete places, places of concrete oppression. So say, for example, a lot of sort of day labor work, a lot of folks who are trying to get jobs on the street are oftentimes face sort of direct police repression, or put in jail, or are sent to ICE and deported. So what I'm interested in is what are these acts of repression? How do people resist, and how do the places that they live in provide support to elevate those voices of the most marginalized? So I'm really interested in sort of the materiality of repression and the materiality of resistance. And for me, cities are important places because of the fact that these are places where a big city like Los Angeles, where you can have a lot of resources, different types of organizations, pulling resources together, incompatible resources together, and providing sort of support to those groups. But these are also places that are sort of that you can create counter-publics, that you can create what Nancy Fraser calls a counter-public, which are spaces in which people who are oppressed connect to one another. And this is like in a small association, small community center, and start to make sense of both their oppression and what to do. So for me, and this is a process of storytelling. This is a process of dialogue. So in order to actually become political and move into a political space, you have to have some kind of conception of that you're being oppressed, that it's systematic, that it's not necessarily an individual problem, that it's a systemic problem, that others are experiencing the same problems as you, and then you create some kind of identity of why it's needed to act, why you have value, why you have rights, and why you deserve recognition as a human being. So for me, cities, it doesn't necessarily happen, and we've done sort of studies on this. So you can have internet and stuff like that, but it's a dispersed and fractured space. But for early types of mobilizations to occur and to create those types of collective identities, oftentimes it just bubbles up through these types of grassroots that are supported by various types of organizations that permit the types of organizations that Marcus is talking about. But for me, I see that happening locally and building up through different types of state and national networks in order to get to the federal government. And I do think the federal sphere is important, but as an urbanist, I mean, for me, I think that the right has been extremely effective because they have a multi-scale strategy. So the left, the immigrant rights movement, the big fault of the immigrant rights movement is that it only focused on the federal government and left the cities and the states and the counties completely open to counterattack by the right. Whereas the right built up their capacity and passed legislation all throughout school districts. The left is completely absent on school districts. The right has an absolute line on the school districts. And those are the trenches that actually change hearts and minds. And the left really just focused on legislation at the federal level. And that was, I think, a terribly... And you see all these different types of organizations, from feminist organizations to immigrant rights organizations, et cetera. And they're all sort of centrally focused because, I mean, that's sort of the tradition of the left. Try to get big legislation, it makes sense. Try to get big legislation and it sort of simmers down. But then the strategy needs to be much more sort of trench and multi-scalar. So the city still matters.
Before we open it up for questions and answers, Haj, I want to give you an opportunity just to reflect upon what you've heard from Walter and Marcus.
Yeah, there's so much that's really fruitful here. I could talk for 4 more hours about all of it. I do want to take an opportunity just to reflect as well, though. I think for me, this is so surreal. I have been, especially since it's not lost on me that it's Banned Books Week, which is not a thing I ever thought would happen in my lifetime. And I've been reflecting on how when I was a kid, I always wanted to write a book because books were, for me, just a space of escape from a world that made me feel like such an outsider. I think a lot of us have had those experiences of walking into a public library and it feels like you're at home. These are my friends. And so for me to be sitting here looking at the book I wrote, it's surreal.
And the cake.
Yeah, and the cake. Don't forget the book cake. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, this process has been one of thinking about writing as escape. And it's really through the process of writing and sitting with these histories of the Black freedom struggle that it came to me that, words are not just about escape, right? Words are about confrontation. They're about awakening. And I think that's really what I hope you all will take away from the struggle for the People's King is the idea that words can be both. I think it's a space for us to really ring the alarm on the crises of multicultural democracy right now, the fact that it's slipping away under our noses. And I think, both Marcus and Walter have talked about in these sort of different spaces, all the ways that it's leaving. It's going to go away if we don't do anything about it. But I also think, for me, one of the big takeaways from the book is that words can also be a space to envision. So I hope that we'll also think about the ways that The book helps us speculate about the futures that could be, that have never been. I think in the spirit of kind of Afrofuturism, thinking about futures as a space of liberation, I do think it's an opportunity for us to actually exercise and fight for our imaginations, because if there's anything that banned books are about, it's about caging our imaginations and holding them captive. So I feel so passionately about it. And I really think it's, for me, one of the big takeaways from the book and our conversation today. So thank you all.
So I think there's a microphone that's floating around. There we go. So please, let's open it up for questions, comments, observations. It would be great if you could speak in the mic so we can get on video. Feel free to address any panelists or the panel as a whole. Who wants to ask our first question?
So I am really interested in like intersectionality in social movements in between different movements, and I think I've found recently that like there's been a lot of critique on that and pushback from, for example, like I work with the American Cancer Society, and like doing the issues of climate change, which are like, you know, might impact health outcomes later on, or for example, race, and that's something that they've only recently been working on. And there is a lot of pushback because people are like, I don't have the resources to think about new things. And I think I've been trying to understand like the benefits of, I think it's beneficial to like think of that as a lens, but do you guys think that it is good, and how might different movements work together to overall make change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so there's a chapter in the book where I think about, it's for me one of the more hopeful chapters. I think about the Me Too movement as it intersects with Black feminism, and the way that, you know, Me Too is rooted in a history of Black feminism, intersectionality, thinking about the way that, you know, the different sort of social locations that we live in make us more or less precarious when we're thinking about violence and the sorts of things that we experience, and then also our opportunities for recourse, the opportunity to be heard and to be trusted as credible. So for me, that's a chapter that does help us think a lot about how intersectionality is not just a kind of performative buzzword that we throw out there, and, you know, you have like your token Black queer woman, you got your token Muslim woman. I'm thinking about like the Women's March, right? But no hate, because I went to it and I loved it. But I do think it's an opportunity to think more deeply about the histories between the movements, the sort of systems of power that potentially kept them apart, the relationships to one another, and think of it more as a way to connect and build a shared history, as opposed to just kind of doing like the quote unquote oppression Olympics that Anj Marie Hancock describes so well. So, I mean, I think if we're thinking specifically about environment and like climate justice, that is a history that's rooted in, you know, yeah, you know this, right? Like that's the history of Black struggle. That's where environmental justice comes from. So for me, part of it is like the internal reckonings within movements are so necessary, because that is the space where movements actually grapple with their history. And that is an opportunity to actually write your existence in the future, you know, by writing it into the past. So I don't know, Marcus, do you want to?
Sure. Two things. The Trail of Tears makes eminent domain possible. Enslavement, also known as subhuman bondage, shout out to Bob Marley, also creates detention camps, prison industrial complex, poverty. So I think part of what we do a disservice to ourselves with is because we don't feel we have the history of that, or we came here at a different time, we don't see that there are real like concepts, let's just, you know, dehumanize it, make it a concept, that are pregnant with possibilities for freedom. If there is a country founded on people not being people, because I think one thing we should always remember is that the Constitution to me stands as a draft as long as the 3/5 Amendment is in as a strike through. Because at any point it's suggesting you can remove the strike through. Like it's still there. So it's to say that when we're thinking about intersectional struggles, I think we ought to start at a foundation of basic principles. if there is a nation founded on enslavement. Enslavement is a very useful concept to build all sorts of freedom movements from, because it is saying that there are people who are human who are not. So any other thing that you experience, an institution, a policy, a law, an experience that makes you feel less than human, is rooted in a whole infrastructure of enslavement. So also understanding that rather than, shying away from it and going like, that's only black people's topic, or that's only like radical wing people's conversation, is to understand what it authorizes, permits, and perpetuates. If you have dispossession as a major part of your idea of being a country, it means that people being dispossessed is going to be a continued experience until such time you confront it, make it a part of unified movements that say, we understand that this is a foundation of this America. We don't want that America anymore. We want one that has reconciled that that was a previous foundation. So that, I think, is really the core, where a lot of people just shy away and look for the present intersectional person, the disabled lesbian who's black, who lives in the south side of Chicago, using her to do all of those things, when in fact, she comes from a genealogy of enslaved people and dispossessed people.
Intersectionality, I'll just say something very briefly. I think we live in an intersectional world, and I think it makes sense. It's a sociological reality. But at the same time, in terms of sort of frame making, and social movements, sometimes it gets a little bit complicated, because frames need to be. This is sort of the memory part, You have to have a sort of a resonant message, and you have to sort of elevate one thing versus the other. And if you reveal the type of complexity in your political discourse, you lose people, and you fail to create that type of resonance that's needed to create the political support and the movement. So there's a sort of an inherent paradox. On the one hand, we do live in intersectional worlds. We do live into these types of interlaced power networks that reflect our lives and shape our identities. But at the same time, that makes framing difficult, and that makes the construction of powerful resonant identities or representations very, very, very difficult. And that's it. So, and on the other hand, there's also, I don't necessarily, I also think that there's, one of the important things about intersectionality is that there are class differences. So we can have sort of these different types of identities that interlink, but on the other hand, there's also very powerful class identities, which in the last instance, people will mobilize against others for the purposes of maintaining their privilege and power. So I think that that's also important. So I think oftentimes when we talk about intersectionality, it's a long list of various forms of oppression and exclusion, while the issue, the very profound issue of class, is lost. And I think that that's important, because that makes things very difficult. I'd say, gentrification, environmental justice, everything.
Believe it or not, we're coming to the end of our time, so let's have one more question from the audience. Who wants to?
So the legacy of the civil rights movement has been whitewashed and co-opted by many groups, in the words of Dr. King, used in a wide variety of ways, ignoring both the lineage that he comes from and the philosophical tradition. How do we recenter the Black freedom struggle in all of this work, remembering just last year with LA City Council that the Black freedom struggle is constantly pushed aside by groups who have benefited from it?
Yeah, oh my gosh, thank you. That's the big question. Yeah, I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So how do we do it? I think part of it is that there are so many folks that have been doing it, and the Black grassroots communities, they are the ones, right, that have actually been resisting at every turn. That was one of the big findings in the book, is that it's so easy to just see the right-wing co-optations. Part of that is a media story, because for me it was really disturbing to find that, of course, the clickbait was what would sort of make it to the top on the New York Times. You would not even find news of the resistance against these misuses of King's legacy. I'd have to find it on an organizational page or a blog post, right? So it's sort of the story about what actually makes it into the news, what actually gets represented in terms of these misuses. I don't have a lot of hope for media, but I do think it is that grassroots story that does give me hope, which is the movements that come out of Black Lives Matter, like #ReclaimKing. And that's a movement that uplifts not just the radical legacy, but also the folks that were written out of the story, right? Because King was part of a movement. He was one of many. There were so many that made him, including his own wife, civil rights activist Coretta Scott King. And so I think lifting up those stories, writing the radical legacy for a new age, one that's global, intersectional, really focused on interconnected systems of injustice. I think that's part of the story, is actually connecting to the folks that are already doing it. I think the more sort of concrete takeaway that I always talk about is, and I made a little cutesy acronym for it, is ARC. So it comes from the quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And then the ARC is A for advocate, R for relate, which is really about the relationships and community building, the deep human connections on the ground. And then C, which is create, which is the freedom dreams, the speculation, the imagination. So for me, that's one of the ways that everyday people who are not formal activists can be just in their everyday lives fighting these misuses and revisionist histories.
Yeah, I think we need a massive detox on negative information about Black people. I mean, that's just a big thing there. And part of how you counter it is with new information, which is why there are banned books, So there are these attempts being made, but then there's the kind of backlash to trying to do that. And I think in the meantime, one thing I think is important is that Black people lean into their experience and understand it is way more capacious than even we think. That if we get things, everybody gets stuff. That's just the way it's set up. And I mean, there's so many historical examples from ethnic studies in colleges, just to welfare. Like when Black people got public housing in Philadelphia, Black people and white people got public housing in Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit. You could go down the line and seeing how our experience actually does have a benefit to all people. And I think there's a tendency to want to hedge bets on it and go Black and brown. Black, brown, Native, Indigenous, Black, brown, LGBT, we're not as confident that our experience is as capacious as it really is, which is one of the big takeaways of the book for me is if you're able to use Martin Luther King in all of these different ways, that says our stuff is rich. You can enrich things that you don't agree with using our stuff. So one, reclaiming our stuff. And being confident in it and not feeling like we have to add a lot of phrases or adjectives onto our experience in order for it to feel inclusive. Because when people say Black Lives Matter, what's also important is that it is affirming for Black people to hear that in a steady diet where you don't hear that at all. But what it tells you about society is that people go, well, why does one life matter more than the other? And this is something that Haj documents very well. It's yeah, because we are programmed to hear Black people say anything positive about themselves, ask for anything for themselves as selfish and not beneficial to everyone. That tells us how deeply entrenched the anti-Blackness is. You can't even say, hey, I don't like my steak medium rare. Black people like their steak well done. Let's just use that as a cultural anecdote. Well, what about all the people who like it rare? He's like, I just said what I like. So also understanding that part of what hits our confidence in being able to own our issues is that there are these knee-jerk reactions that people are programmed to hear Black thing only. Last thing I'll say is in my class, I teach this really big class at UCLA, and it's called the Social Organization of Black Communities. And I do these activities called brain lotion. The theory being, ashy mind is not a healthy mind, okay? And so I put up phrases. It says president, music, politics. And I asked the students for 60 seconds. Write what comes up when you see president, politics, music. Then the next activity, Black president, Black music, Black politics. And what you find is that all of a sudden, those big words become really small. Or people start feeling like, I can't relate, Black politics, something I can't talk about, that's Black people's issue. And I think that's one of the other issues is to understand that there is a whole bunch of infrastructure around making Black things seem small, making Black things seem like they're not accessible, making Black things seem exclusive, and it's not Black people doing that. So how can we all lean into the fact, again, enslavement really happened. It really founded this country. Why are we not leaning into that as a way for us to all get our freedoms? It makes sense to me why Muslim Americans are finding a struggle now is because no one's leaning into the fundaments. You got to lean into the fundaments if you want to have something more. And so my encouragement is really about owning your issue, being proud about it, and not being dissuaded to thinking that you're talking really small. Oh, you're talking really small. Obama, black president, I'm the president of all America. That's a disservice. If you're a black president and you were elected, of course you're a president for everyone else. But it's important that we mark you are a black president and you're able to serve everyone else by being a black president. That helps to disrupt the vocabulary of inferiority that is embedded in all things black in this country.
So I think that there's it's a really good question, but I also think that when I was reading your book, I was wondering, like where like there's a the king becomes like a floating signifier, you know? And it's just you just sort of get lost in what Haj calls gnarled branches, which is I think is a wonderful term. And you start to see everybody's vying for king, all these different movements, and there's all these different types of recreations of king, which is sort of interesting because on the one hand, you're reproducing sort of the values of king, but on the other hand, you're constantly sort of innovating and transforming king to the point that it's like, where is the true king? And then I started to think, like, where is the true king by the end of the book? And that becomes sort of a very complicated situation, no? And it's also interesting in the first chapter when you're talking about the creation of the holiday of king. So there was, this chapter is interesting because of the fact that these white Southern guys, these senators, were really pushing back against King because he was a militant and he was a terrible guy and he was anti-American, no? But his supporters, the left, were saying no, he was a great American. That starts there's an employment of sort of assimilationist language. No, he's absolutely American. He wanted to contribute to make this country more beautiful, more meritocratic. No, so there's this complete sort of inversion that I think is going on. No, so again, where is the true king? It's very difficult to tell. Everybody's in the political fight results in a radical distortion that becomes, I think, at a certain point, impossible to find the truth.
Before we end this evening, I wanted to give our friend, our colleague, and the author of this brilliant book the final word, just to close us out. This final thoughts you might have this evening based on what you've heard and where we are.
Yeah, this has been such a rich discussion. I've 3,000 other things I would love to say, but I really want to celebrate. So what I really want to leave us with is, I think maybe like one of my new favorite quotes from King. I think there's so many. He's so charismatic. You would like read any speech and just pull out 300 different things. But for me, it's the one that I think we should sort of walk out of here with. And it's in the spirit of, I think, what we've talked about, which is a ton of like ringing alarms about how dire the situation is and the fact that there's hope, that there are sort of histories we can turn to, there's imaginations we can turn to, freedom dreams. And it's a quote that comes from his speech Beyond Vietnam, which is a moment where he is very unpopularly speaking out against the war in Vietnam. And he says, "Let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world."
Beautiful struggle. Well, this was an amazing way to spend a Thursday evening. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. I hope you found this conversation as enlightening and as inspiring as I did. Please join me again in thanking our incredible panelists, Professor Walter Nicholls, Professor Marcus Hunter, and of course, our very own Professor Hajar Yazdiha.